Welcome back, everyone. First off, some breaking news. The series of disasters is continuing in China with ongoing floods and 5 earthquakes between July 12th and 13th. So first off, July 12th, this included a 5.1 magnitude earthquake about 19 miles from the city of Tangshan in Hebei. And this is a serious issue in China. This raised concerns of a repeat of the 7.8 magnitude earthquake in that same area that took place in 1976 and killed over 240,000 people. And the same day this happened, there was a 4.4 magnitude earthquake about 34 miles from the Honghe Hani and the Yi Autonomous Prefecture in Yunnan. A 4.7 magnitude earthquake hit about 35 miles from the Gannan Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture in Gansu. A 4.1 magnitude earthquake hit about 84 miles from Hotan Prefecture in Xinjiang. And the following day, on July 13, a 5.0 magnitude earthquake hit about 22 miles from Yiling in Xinjiang. Now, the damage from these recent earthquakes does appear to be minimal for now, but they're raising concerns about more serious earthquakes that may follow, and also other impacts such as landslides in areas that are already facing heavy rainfall and the floods taking place right now in central and southern China. And on the note of these floods, they are continuing. Heavy rains are continuing now for over 40 days in some areas. Water levels are rising in the Yangtze River, which is the longest river in Asia and the third longest in the world. At Poyang Lake, the largest freshwater lake in China, located in Jiangxi, water levels have risen to historic levels. Many areas in China are seeing dikes collapse, leading to additional flooding in those areas. In many towns of Poyang County, for example, there were many residents who have been evacuated. Aerial footage of some of these towns looked like wetlands. And trapped villagers in the area told the Epoch Times in interviews, of course we're blacklisted in China, but we can get phone calls, we do have sources on the ground. They were saying that water surface of the Poyang Lake has continued to rise. They say many dikes in the areas have collapsed, and they say many residents have lost their homes and their farms. Among the impacted areas is Mianchuan, which has a population of around 36,700 people and about 11,372 acres of farmland. And adding to all of this, recent outbreaks of foot and mouth disease in Leizhou City in Guangdong is raising additional concerns over the pork supplies in China. And this is amid the ongoing swine flu outbreaks and also recent news that the swine flu may have mutated to create a new pandemic potential virus. Now, the CCP's Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs announced on July 11 that the Guangdong Provincial Animal Disease Prevention and Control Center confirmed this new outbreak. And meanwhile, the Chinese regime has placed sanctions on 3 U.S. lawmakers and 1 ambassador. And this was openly done in retaliation against these different lawmakers for their work to sanction CCP officials that are involved in human rights abuses of Muslims in Xinjiang in China. Among those sanctioned are Senators Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, Representative Chris Smith, and Ambassador for Religious Freedom Sam Brownback. They will be unable to travel to China because of this, and while the CCP has not given complete details on what this will entail, its foreign ministry spokesperson says the sanctions will mirror those placed on Chinese officials by the United States. Now, Chinese netizens were quick to mock the CCP for doing this. One of them wrote this, quote, "Oh, their kids can't be sent to China for school. It's terrible." And that's a tongue-in-cheek jab against Chinese officials who often send their kids to study abroad in the United States. Another wrote this, quote, "The most powerful sanction, issue them Chinese citizenships." These Chinese netizens, they have pretty good senses of humor typically. Now, another question and another jab against Chinese officials who often offshore wealth and send their families abroad, quote, "Without their assets, wives, and children in China, how will they execute the sanctions?" Now, the move does appear to be part of a broader push by the CCP, however. It followed statements from Communist Party leader Xi Jinping, who suggested just last week that China could begin pressing charges against Americans for espionage. And this was in response to operations by the FBI that are placing heavy emphasis on uprooting Chinese espionage in the United States, including in universities and in different research positions. Now, soon after Xi said that, the Chinese Communist Party announced it was amending its criminal code to prosecute foreign businesses for theft of trade secrets. And the United States, meanwhile, issued a travel advisory to China saying that Americans face a, quote, heightened risk of arbitrary detention. Now, the alert from the U.S. Embassy and consulates in China warning Americans to, quote, exercise increased caution in China. U.S. citizens may be detained without access to U.S. consular services or information about their alleged crime. U.S. citizens may be subjected to prolonged interrogations and extended detention for reasons related to, quote, state security. And it also says, quote, security personnel may detain and or deport U.S. citizens for sending private electronic messages critical of the PRC government, People's Republic of China. Now, the Chinese Communist Party responded to the travel advisory through its state-run Global Times, and it cited the Chinese Foreign Ministry accusing it of, quote, not holding water, and then accused the United States of spreading conspiracies and of being hostile towards the CCP. And meanwhile, on top of all of this, tech companies including Google, Facebook, Twitter, and others have publicly stated they will limit their cooperation with Hong Kong authorities on data requests, and this is after the Chinese Communist Party imposed its new national security laws in Hong Kong. So, what does this all mean? What's the significance of all of this? Now, when it comes to economic theft, the Chinese Communist Party very likely would launch tit-for-tat, say, prosecutions against Americans for allegedly stealing intellectual property. And very likely they would use their different forms of trade war, their different forms of patent war to justify this. Now, one of the things the Chinese Communist Party does, and there have been a lot of reports on this, is they do what's called patent warfare. So what they do is they will steal, say, intellectual property from major U.S. businesses. They will find the, say, documents on the designs of the products, and they will file the patent for those products in China. And so the CCP will own the patents. They've done this to different companies, including Apple in the past. At least evidence suggested they did so, where they copied, say, iPhones down to the last screw they've been accused of doing. And then a company out of the blue that no one's ever heard of will then sue Apple after they try and go after the CCP for this, sue them for, say, economic theft. And also with this new national security law in Hong Kong, this could mean a lot of different things for U.S. businessmen and officials traveling to China, or even to countries that have extradition treaties with China. For example, if they have a layover in another country and, say, the Chinese Communist Party put out a secret arrest warrant for them. And for the CCP, this would be a tit-for-tat move again. This is not unheard of. So, for example, Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei, was arrested in Canada and is facing extradition to the United States for some of the underhanded business deals Huawei was involved in, some of the different operations Huawei was involved in. Now, she hasn't been officially charged in the U.S. with that yet. She's facing extradition right now, and this has been going on for quite a while. But it would not be unheard of for the Chinese Communist Party to do something similar, which means even C-level executives at major businesses could be extradited, could be arrested like this, because that's what's happening right now to Meng Wanzhou in the CCP's eyes. You know, she's the CFO of Huawei, one of the largest telecommunications companies in the world. She's like, you know, that's like China's equivalent of Apple, to give an example of this. Or like Cisco. Imagine the CFO of Cisco or Apple was arrested in Canada or another country and was facing extradition to China. The CCP is now talking about doing things like this. And you can imagine as well the impact on transnational corporations. A lot of businesses, even if they have their offices in the United States, even if they began in the United States, many of them are transnational corporations. They don't have loyalty to any one country. And a lot of them do have major offices in China. And so what does it mean if the CCP wants to go after them? They have a lot of room to do so right now if they choose to do so. And they are signaling that they will. Now, we'll have to see how this plays out. Meanwhile, Trump advisor on China, Peter Navarro, is saying to expect the Trump administration to take additional actions against TikTok and WeChat. And Trump is also saying the Phase 2 trade deals with China are now no longer a priority, as the relationship between China and the United States are, quote, severely damaged. And also, Trump National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien left on a 3-day trip to Paris, where he's going to meet with European officials to discuss Western competition with China in various areas, including supply chains and 5G technology. Now, so what are we looking at here? When it comes to these supply chain threats, the United States right now, as we speak, is working on implementing new laws that will forbid, say, Chinese technology from being in the supply chain of tech products being sold to the U.S. government. It's possible that these individuals going now to Europe to talk to these European leaders are going to be related to that in some way, if they're talking about supply chain threats within 5G. In other words, the United States is now raising alarms about the CCP's use of chips, the CCP's use of firmware, CCP's use of software like these apps, to possibly use them for espionage against different countries. And this is part of the larger trend we're seeing right now when it comes to technology. Now, if the United States is to kick out, for example, TikTok and these other Chinese apps from these app stores, if the United States were to actually go after the CCP for these different, say, supply chain threats on a larger scale, it's already a pretty big deal if they're going after them in terms of government contracts, but on a larger scale, this is going to massively, very likely massively hit a lot of the Chinese high-tech industry and also a lot of their core programs for economic expansion, such as the One Belt, One Road initiative. And again, if these officials are not going to talk about 5G, for example, that is something that hits directly on the One Belt, One Road initiative. And now for the broader stories for today. First off, China's stock boom is already starting to slow, and various news outlets are now warning the market may have more risks than it's worth. By Friday, the benchmark index was down by 1.7%. The Financial Times noted that retail investment had stalled. CNBC warned readers not to, quote, chase Chinese stocks at these levels. And CNN warned that while the stocks look attractive, quote, going too high too fast is risky. And this aligns with what we've been saying on this show as well. This stock boom was set off by the Chinese Communist Party's state-run media. And it's easy to do. You can orchestrate a boom if you make enough excitement around it. This is a common tactic. And individuals who say have enough influence to say if their statements can get investors to put money in or pull money out of somewhere, they can give a statement and cause booms or busts within a stock market. The CCP understands this, and so they use their state media to claim that the Chinese market is on a rebound, that it's time to put money into China. But at the same time they're telling this to the outside world, they're saying something very differently in China, as we've mentioned before. Now, the internal data in China is showing otherwise. Again, the Chinese Communist Party is facing massive economic problems right now. Businesses have been under pretty much during the entire virus lockdown. Many of them are defaulting on loans. The CCP is going to investors in China and to banks in China and telling them to forego their own profits and seizing their money from them in order to help with this. And then it's telling Western investors that it's safe to put your money into China during the same time. And as this is happening as well, they're not ending all these lockdowns, the lockdowns which are attributed to the market taking such a big hit. The CCP in Beijing right now has similar lockdowns in place. They're not calling it an official lockdown, but all these same measures are there. They're considering putting down Hong Kong, putting Hong Kong under lockdown. And also as they pass these new national security laws in Hong Kong, in addition to all of this, the CCP is losing a lot of its trade benefits that it had through Hong Kong, access it had to the international markets. And while all of this is taking place, they're having natural disasters all across China, not just these heavy floods in 26 provinces and cities throughout southern China, but things like earthquakes and other things. And so what's happening right now? The Chinese market, according to the CCP itself, is in dire straits. It is in a very bad situation. They had their state-run media say otherwise. State-run media came out and said it is now safe to invest in China. Stock markets are about to boom. As soon as people see the rising prices, of course, they pour their money into it because they want to catch that excitement and then hopefully pull out before the whole thing crashes again. And they're now being warned, even some of the mainstream news outlets are seeing this. They're being warned that it is very likely a dangerous proposition if you want to put your money into China right now, given this overall situation. And also the Chinese ambassador to India, Sun Weidong, said on July 10th that India and China should be, quote, partners rather than rivals, and said the two countries need to find a, quote, reasonable solution to their border conflicts. So what's this in relation to? You remember the story of these Chinese soldiers who killed 20 Indian soldiers along the disputed border when they had these clashes over that disputed territory. Now, India, after that incident, began decoupling from China even further than they were already planning to. They began pushing back not just against the CCP economically, but diplomatically. They're, for example, inviting Australia to participate in war games right now. They're going against the CCP on every level they possibly can. The pushback against the CCP from India right now, at least in my analysis, is very likely more than China bargained for. The thinking of why the CCP would do this, why this whole thing would happen. Now, evidence suggested, can't say for sure, but evidence did suggest, and this is widely reported in India right now, Evidence suggested that the CCP may have intentionally orchestrated that violence. For example, it sent in different troops from outside of that region to go to that area right around the time of these attacks. And so the individuals who carried out these violent attacks on the Indian troops, who killed 20 Indian soldiers, were not from that area normally. And they normally have the same general group of soldiers, in this disputed territory. And of course, they alert them if new soldiers are coming in so they know who they are. And in addition to this, there were also reporting in India saying that this was orchestrated by the CCP, that the CCP had given orders to carry out this violence. So again, it suggests that it may have been pre-planned. Regardless of this, why would the CCP want to do that? What would the interest of the CCP be? Well, when it comes to China right now, they're facing a lot of pushback from the social level. A lot of Chinese people are unhappy with the Chinese Communist Party. They're angry about its lack of response for the floods. They're angry about the lack of relief they are receiving. Now, yes, some actions have been taking place, but not nearly enough according to people we've been interviewing on the ground in some of these areas. You also have what's happening in Hong Kong, for example, where Hong Kongers have just lost their basic rights to the Chinese Communist Party. And so facing all this pushback from within its own borders, what does the CCP do? Well, just like controlling a wildfire, they lit another fire to control the burn, so to speak. And they did this attack very likely in India based on that analysis, to, for example, stir up the patriotic emotions of Chinese to get them angry at another country. Now, India is often the scapegoat for this. India is often the target when they want to do things like this. But very likely they did not plan on the amount that India would push back against its actions. India, in every way right now, is trying to decouple from China. Now, moving on, Foreign Policy is reporting that with the CCP's new push for the national security laws in Hong Kong, quote, Beijing launches a global assault on free speech. And yes, this is true. Basically, in Hong Kong right now, you used to have basic protections for free speech. You had freedom of the press, even though it's technically part of China. They had a one country, two systems policy. The laws of the mainland typically did not extend into Hong Kong. And so Hong Kong, while being under the CCP still technically, was not being held by the totalitarian laws of the Communist Party. Those protections are now gone. And Hong Kong's loss of these freedoms is now beginning to impact other countries as well. The Chinese Communist Party has stated that it can enforce these laws in other parts of the world, which has raised concerns in many countries, for example in Australia, of what will happen if you travel back to China or travel to China even as a foreigner, and the CCP determines that you made Facebook posts or online posts criticizing the regime and should be put on trial for that, which you could face charges for if you were Chinese. And so yes, right now freedom of speech and press freedom is being undermined by the CCP. But also this is something the CCP has been doing for decades. This is something the CCP has been active at for a very long time now. For example, when the CCP demonstrated it was able to censor the NBA, when different individuals in the NBA came out in support of the Hong Kong protesters, the Chinese Communist Party demonstrated that it had enough influence financially over the NBA to silence them, to make them side with the CCP in its censorship. They tried doing the same thing to South Park, you might remember, when the makers of South Park came out and criticized the CCP, and the Chinese Communist Party tried putting pressure on them. You see the same thing with academics, you see the same thing with journalists, where if they go to China, they have to abide by the CCP's rules of censorship or they lose their visas. And if they want to ever travel to China, they have to abide by its laws as well. This is why Epoch Times, for example, is blacklisted in mainland China. We are not allowed in mainland China because we do not abide by their censorship. This ties into a bigger picture as well. The Chinese Communist Party was allowed entry into the Western markets and institutions under the belief that doing so, that giving them that access, would make China more free and less communistic. Now, this has been something that Republicans and Democrats have been doing, going back to Nixon, going back to Bush, going back to Obama. Every one of them had some role in this. And basically the thinking was this, that if China is a communist state, if they're a communist system, then giving them access to the free market and helping them become more capitalistic will very likely help erode the communist influences. And we did not see that. The CCP created a hybrid form of communism, basically, which is really what state capitalism is, or what they call socialism, for example, where the Communist Party, the tyrannical government in place, using what the Chinese regime calls socialism with Chinese characteristics, is able to essentially nationalize the marketplaces. So these look like public companies, but they're under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. And the CCP has extended that same reach into international institutions. It uses international institutions to extend its reach beyond its own borders, to enforce things like censorship beyond its own borders, to use international institutions like it's being accused of on many fronts right now to push its own interests into the broader community of the world. And so yes, we are seeing right now that through Hong Kong and these new national security laws, the CCP is trying to restrict free speech all around the world, even going after things like Facebook, which they say they can force to remove content, although Facebook has said they will not go along with it. Going after Western tech companies, trying to force them to censor. The CCP is demonstrating this right now in a way that they already had some influence over already. But we now see a national and global debates being sparked around this. In other words, yes, while this issue has been going on for a long time now, it is now finally, after all these years, becoming part of the national discussion. And meanwhile, the US government has said it will strongly enforce a new law that bans technology with any parts manufactured by Chinese companies from being purchased by the US government. Now, this is part of a law that was passed back in 2018, but it's only going into effect now in August. And so what's the broader picture of this? The US government has been warning about supply chain threats from China for close to a decade now. Even during the Obama administration, this was a big issue. For example, the US military, the Pentagon, had conducted a review of its different technological equipment, and they found that some parts from China were non-functional. And they also found that there were security risks in some of these, say, core pieces of technology that were in these different chips and these different parts that they were buying from China. They were being used in things like US jets. And so the US now is finally doing something about this. But while this was a known issue, while the Pentagon issued reports warning about it while it was part of congressional discussion and debate, very little was done about it officially. But now we see that changing. And this could actually have a pretty broad impact on most Chinese tech companies and most tech companies in the United States as well. Now, many tech companies sell products under government contracts, smartphones, computers, technology, and so on. Even some of the smaller, say, computer parts that are manufactured and put in different chips and so on in different equipment. None of this now can have any ties to Chinese companies. And so what does this mean? It means that either these companies will have to create separate products just for their government contracts, or they will have to, say, take their factories from China and move them elsewhere, maybe to India, maybe to Pakistan, maybe to other countries, and ensure that China has no influence over the parts being manufactured there. Or it possibly means moving the factories back to the United States. The bigger picture here, though, is the CCP is losing this manufacturing base. And also Chinese technology overall now is being seen as a national security threat. And on this note too, the Chinese Communist Party has had similar laws in place for years, say banning US equipment, US technologies from some of their government contracts. The US never did a tit-for-tat retaliation on that. You might remember some of the debates, for example, around Apple and say Microsoft trying to sell products in China and had the problems they were running into when dealing with the CCP around this. So the CCP has been doing similar things for years now. And the US now is only beginning to do the same thing back to an extent, based on these concerns over national security problems within some of these core components in our technology. With that said, folks, again, we broadcast Monday through Friday, 5 days a week, so be sure to tune in. And also, if you want to support this channel, we do have a Patreon. You can find the link to it in the description below. And also for our Patreon supporters, every Sunday, we do a live Q&A, so be sure to tune in for that. And also, folks, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Again, really need your support building this channel. And also, if you want to go the extra mile, tell a friend or family member about this show. With that said, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.